Hi, I'm Carolyn from Just So Happy, and I'm so glad you joined us for 12 Days of Christmas. Today's project is a roll-up organizer, perfect for cords, paintbrushes, art supplies, even maybe some crayons or colored pencils for a kid in your life, or really just anything that you can fit in 2 pockets this size. Okay. This roll-up organizer is so adaptable, and as soon as you're ready to go, all you have to do, tuck all your supplies in, and wrap the straps around, tuck them under, or give them a tie, and you're all set to go. Okay, so let's talk about what you'll need for this project. This actually only takes 2 fat quarters and then some stiff interfacing. I'm going to be using Decor Bond, Pelon 809, but really any stiff interfacing will help this just stand up to a lot of use over time. The other thing that you want to do with your fat quarters after you've pressed them is get them to be the same size. So when fat quarters are cut, usually they're about 18 inches wide, but based on selvages or other things, they may not be quite the exact same size. So trim them down so that you've got the exact same size rectangle. And really, this size rectangle isn't the only size that you could use for this project. You could adapt this if you wanted to make like a crayon organizer instead. You could use a much shorter piece, maybe even a fat 8. So the other thing that you'll want to do is cut off the pieces for the straps that will wrap around your organizer. And I'm going to do that just by cutting off the top 3 inches of both fat quarters. All right. And then those pieces will be what we'll use and create a ribbon substitute. If you wanted to make this project just a little bit faster, you could use ribbon instead. So I've got that 3-inch piece, and then this piece, both of these pieces here, again, they just have to be the same size. But in my case, about the size of a fat quarter, trimmed just a little bit, minus that 3-inch chunk. You also want to cut your interfacing to be the same size as those pieces, just a 1/2 inch smaller all the way around. And one for each of those pieces, one for the outside piece and the lining piece. Now this piece I'm actually going to save for a different project. That's going to be our only piece of leftover for this particular project. We're going to use every other little bit, and I'm going to cut this 3-inch piece in half so that I have 2 1.5-inch pieces that will be my 2 straps to wrap around the organizer. So in my trip to the iron, what I did was I took those 1.5-inch strips and pressed those just in half. So I've got a nice pressed line as a guide, and then of course fused my interfacing to those 2 fat quarter pieces, and that by cutting them just a little bit smaller, it gives me a little bit of a gap around the whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare these pieces for the straps that wrap around. So I'm going to open that up. I've got my pressed line as a guide here. On the very end, I'm just going to tuck this first little edge in. And then these outside edges are going to come into that pressed line. You could use a bias tape tool for this step, but for such small pieces, I think it's all right just to give it a quick finger press, clip it closed. If you wanted to make this project a little bit quicker, you could use ribbon instead of preparing these pieces. All the way down that entire piece. You don't have to finish off the other edge because it'll be tucked inside the seam of the finished project. So that end, the other skinny end, you can just leave open. So I've prepped both of my straps, and that other end is still left just open. And I've also clipped around the edge of my 2 fat quarter pieces, right sides together, so you can see those 2 interfacing sides are facing out. The other thing that you want to keep in mind before you sew all the way around your fat quarter pieces is to leave a gap. So I've actually left a double clip over here just to remind myself to leave that gap right around there as I sew around. So for these strap pieces, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go all the way down and sew this shut and then I'll actually repeat the top stitch on the other side just so that it looks pretty. I also am going to sew across that side that we folded in so that that's our finished edge. I'm just going to go across that front side just twice, just since that's the part that's going to be used the most as this is tied, and then down each end. The first end that I'm actually going to sew is the one that's clipped shut, just so I don't need these clips anymore after this step, and then I'll go from there. All right. Line myself up. Okay, so I top stitched down both sides of each strap, and then now we're ready to sew around the edge of our organizer. So again, I double clip to leave an opening, and I'm also going to back stitch as I start just past there. Your seam allowance doesn't matter too much. It's really just as long as it's the same all the way around. You can really play that based on your preference. I'm actually just going to use the edge of my foot. But again, the important thing here is that when you start, just back stitch just a little bit so that that opening, once you're there, will have just a little bit extra security. The other thing is when you get to a corner, you just want to stop with your needle down and then pivot and keep going until you've made it all the way around. Okay, so and again, as you finish up all the way around, still leaving that gap, but make sure to back stitch there. Okay, so before we turn this right sides out, I'm just going to clip the corners. You want to clip close to your threads, but not through your thread on all four corners, and then you'll turn it right sides out. Give it a good press before we top stitch it all the way around. Okay, so I've got it turned right side out, points out, and then pressed all the way around so that I'm ready to top stitch. Where that gap was, I've just pressed that under as well so that those are ready to be finished edges. But before we sew all of that, we need to go ahead and put our straps in. You want to find the two open ends that you just sewed off the edge of, and those are going to be placed right in your gap, at least a ½ inch. I like to go a little bit more than that. And then just side by side. If you want to leave a little gap between them, that's fine. I'm also going to back stitch over those just one extra time for a little bit extra security. So let's talk about planning out where your pockets are, because depending on what you're using this organizer for, or what you're gifting it based on what person that person might use it for, you may want to use a different strategy for where these pockets will be, because these can be used for paintbrushes, makeup brushes, colored pencils, crayons, markers, any sort of art supplies, of course sewing supplies. Or actually, what I'm going to do for mine is actually to turn this tangled bundle mess of cords and headphones into something that's a little bit nicer to travel with. So based on that, what you want to think about is the height of the items that are going to go in, and also whether or not you just want pockets that are a little bit more shallow or a little deeper, depending on the weight of the object as well. Because if you're doing paintbrushes, those will tuck in pretty nicely, and you don't need any sort of protection on the top, and really you don't need a very deep pocket to be able to protect the weight of a paintbrush.
Okay.
But if you're going to use your organizer, or you think the person that you're gifting it to might use the organizer for something a little heavier, like a rotary cutter, a pair of scissors, anything like that, you probably do want a deeper pocket just to help out with that weight as it's rolled up. And based on that knowledge, I put my ties in the middle, but you may want to shift those up. If you already know that you're going to be putting something heavier in here and you want a really deep pocket, then just shift those up. So instead of being in the middle, they're a little higher toward the top. But the reason I put mine in the middle is because I actually want an organizer that has a pocket and the top's going to come down as a protective flap before it's rolled. So that's still going to be there, and then that's why I wanted my ties in the middle. So you can just measure out your width, evenly space into, I want 6 or 8 pockets or whatever it is. You could also put your items in and then just put a pin or mark on either side of where you want those pockets to go. This fabric actually has some really nice guides that I'm just going to use as my guides for about how wide, and I'm going to use about 1.5 of these sections for each pocket for my cord organizer. So once we're at the sewing machine, we're going to go all the way from the top to the bottom for where that pocket dividing seam will be. And the important thing here is to add a little bit of reinforcement with a back stitch, both at the top and at the bottom for each one. And then of course, down these edges as well to attach the side of your pocket to the side of your organizer, right above where that top stitch already is. And once you've got your pockets sewn, you're ready to fill your organizer. Just like that, you've got something to fit just about anything that needs a little bit of extra structure. Thanks for joining us for 12 Days of Christmas. We hope that you'll join us for the rest of the series.